Thank you so much, Mark, for coming. It's a fantastic pleasure and honor to have you here. When Mark and I started talking about flourishing, Mark characteristically said, you know, I kind of like that. I'm really excited about that, but I have something that you may not like. So he said, you know, what about, I mean, have you thought about all this, all well and good with the flourishing, but what about the suffering? And I said, that's exactly what I want, because of course there cannot be any, perhaps also it's a hypothesis of mine, that true flourishing comes after a lot of suffering. And so it turns out that Mark has been very interested in the Samaritans. And what he'll talk to us about today is the benefits of true listening. I'd like to think, and I'll just leave that thought with you before Mark tells us about his experiences of listening to people who are on the edge, if you like. But one of the things I think would be interesting to think about is whether having somebody truly listen to you, truly seeing who you are, whether that in some sense becomes meaningful or whether something else is at play in this situation. Again, I think that's something we should discuss afterwards. Please, Mark, tell us about your experiences.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Morten. Thanks to the Centre for Eudaimonia and Human Flourishing, and thanks to the college as well for having me. Double thanks for allowing me to wear one of my other hats and not actually talk about Curious Incident for once in my life. That's such a relief. I'm going to talk instead about Samaritans, about the 6 years I've spent volunteering with them in Oxford, and I want to talk about the art, if you want to call it that. Sometimes always fascinating, but sometimes completely counterintuitive of listening to people when they're really suffering. I know this is a bit of a scientific / academic context in which I'm speaking, so I'll just say now that I am neither a scientist nor an academic, so brace yourself for opinion, anecdote, and no graphs whatsoever. I'll try and give you a bit of edification and occasional moments of entertainment, and we can probably get through it together, okay? Let me start off with a bit of organisational history about the Samaritans. There's a young assistant curate in the Church of England called Chad Vara. In 1935, the first service he ever took, he officiated at the funeral of a 14-year-old girl who'd taken her own life. She just started menstruating and she believed that she acquired a sexually transmitted disease. The experience really haunted him over the coming years. And he eventually set up a phone line in the crypt of the church where he was curate. To do two things: one, to offer sexual advice for people, and also to offer some comfort for people who are feeling suicidal. The first phone call was taken, I think, in 1953, and from those beginnings, the Samaritans has morphed and grown. The sexual advice side was dropped quite early on, and now it's a national organisation. Unfortunately, slightly saddled with that Old Testament name as a result of a Daily Mirror headline. Unfortunately, it's stuck now, so we can't do a sort of snicks back to Twicker's rebranding. We're just going to have to live with it because that's what everyone knows us as. There's 200 branches in the country, from Truro in Cornwall to Lerwick in the Shetlands. It's about 12,000 trained volunteers at all of those branches. We take calls mostly by phone, but also by email. And we were taking them face to face, but COVID lockdown sort of put the kibosh on that, and we're still waiting to get it back and running again. We do 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Although I have to say that even with the 12,000 volunteers, we still don't manage to get through to all the callers who ring us in the middle of the night. And the main aim of the charity is to reduce the number of people taking their lives by suicide, by giving those people a space to talk about whatever they need to talk about when they're in emotional distress. Up until about 4 or 5 years ago, if you wanted to call the Samaritans, you call your local branch. We now have a new system called Free Call, which does exactly what it says on the tin. It's free to call, which is great. But it also means that whenever you call, you're directed around the country to wherever anyone happens to be free. And also, which I think is really useful, is that when you call the Samaritans, it doesn't go on your phone bill. it comes up as an unidentified number, which is especially useful for people who don't want anyone else in their family to know they've been calling the Samaritans, particularly if they're in an abusive relationship, for example. One of the things I find really amazing about the charity is that there is a central office where everyone is paid, but on a local level, everyone is voluntary, including the people who do the accounts, who do the governance and the management. We're all volunteers, and only Svetlana, our cleaner, is paid. And I think that's still a really admirable testament to the people running the branch. I thought I'd talk for 40 minutes, by the way, and then you can ask me questions. I'm just telling you now, so you can come up with some penetrating and incisive questions. And if you can't, I'll ask myself some penetrating and incisive questions. That's all right. So alongside the organisational history, I'll give you a bit of personal history about how I ended up there. Several centuries ago, I did a degree in English at Merton College. In some respects, it was great, but I had a real sense that it was 3 years which was all about me. I sometimes described it as like being force-fed birthday cake for 3 years. I got this real desire for a long, clear, cold glass of water at the end of it. I was part of a circle of friends who were all quite socially conscious. They'd all been to state school. And it felt like the last year or two before the cold winds of Thatcherism blew through the university system. And by the time we'd gone, other people were doing law conversion courses and getting jobs in banking. But we still felt that sort of freedom to go on the dole and join a punk band or be a starving artist. Or in the case of my friends, one went off to St Mary's in London to trade as a nurse. One worked teaching English to young Bangladeshi women in Oxford. Another ran a radical bookshop. I signed up with an organisation called Community Service Volunteers and was sent to Livingston Newtown in Scotland, where I was one of 2 volunteers who lived in to help a young man who had late-stage multiple sclerosis. He was paralysed from the neck down, so needed absolutely everything doing for him. I and the other volunteer did 24-hour shifts on and then off. We turned him through the night to prevent pressure sores. We changed his catheter bag. We fed him. We did all the washing, all the cooking. I even vividly remember smoking for him. I spent quite a lot of my life doing that. His main problem was not the MS. His main problem that he and my co-volunteer were both members of a small and shrinking and quite aggressive church of born-again evangelical Christians, whose main hobby seemed to be casting people out into the outer darkness. They genuinely believed that I was going to hell, even though I was changing this young man's catheter bag every night. But that was fine, because hell was going to be fantastic. It was just crammed full of Buddhists, lesbians, beer drinkers, tarot card players. It was fine. When the job came to an end, I moved down to London. I did a string of similar jobs working with people who had what was learning difficulties or physical handicaps. And then the drawing, I worked as an illustrator, that took off, my writing took off, and those things slipped away. Until about 7 years ago, and I started to get the birthday cake feeling again. I thought, I really want to do something that is challenging and new and different, where I learn skills I haven't got. And particularly where I get to meet people outside my own sort of rather narrow milieu. So my wife dragged me along to a Samaritans information evening, just off the Italy Road. And several things struck me. One, I thought that what the volunteers were being trained to do was both fascinating and a little scary, but also 2 quite rare things, I think, for organisations. I felt both that it was very efficiently run, but also incredibly warm, and that the branch looked after one another incredibly well. My wife decided not to do it. I signed up, passed the interview, did about 7 weeks of training, and then about 6 weeks of shifts alongside a more experienced volunteer. And it's now 6 years later. It's become this hugely important part of my life. Whenever I'm in Oxford, I do 1 shift a week in the branch at the end of, it's opposite the Pegasus Theatre, the end of Magdalen Road, where there are always 2 volunteers on duty, so that we can both take calls, but also talk to one another after and between calls. And shifts of 3 3/4 hours during the day, or when we do a night shift once a month, it's 4.5 hours. And I'm now Deputy Director in charge of mentoring, so that when new trainees finish their training period and they come into the branch and they go upstairs and they start taking calls, I have a mentee, but I also make sure that all the other trainees have a mentor with them as well, to hold their hand, check everything's okay until they're ready to go solo. I hope that I have on occasions been a lifeline for other people ringing up, but I certainly know that over the last couple of years, when my own mental health has been really quite rocky, and I found it really, really difficult to write and to be creative, that the Samaritans has been a lifeline for me. It's a place I can go every week and a thing I can do every week, not just where I feel useful and I'm doing something really meaningful, but where a typically self-obsessed author who spends a lot of time on their own thinking about themselves have to spend a forced 4 hours thinking 100% about other people. And I often describe coming away from the Samaritans shift as a feeling of having the grubby, messy inside of my head power hosed clean just by thinking about other people and not thinking about myself for 4 hours. So, who calls us? Well, with a couple of caveats that you need to know who we are and what the number is, and you need to have basic English, just enough for a simple conversation. I would say almost everyone calls us. The range is absolutely incredible. When you pick up the phone, you don't know whether you're going to be talking to a surgeon who's just come off a shift, or whether you're going to be talking to someone who is homeless and has a severe drug and alcohol problem. You don't know whether someone's going to be the victim of human trafficking, or whether they've got paranoid schizophrenia, or whether they've got a court case coming up in which they're going to be charged for downloading child abuse images. I think only GPs have the experience of as wide a range of people as we get to experience when we're at Samaritans. And of course, for GPs, they're limited to 15, 20 minutes, absolute maximum. They need to solve a problem for the patient. The patient wants something from them. And there are plenty of things that people don't want to talk about with their GPs. And the other difference is that we get to talk to people in prison. GPs don't get to talk to people in prison. So first digression about prisons. Almost every prison in the UK has a relationship with a local Samaritans branch. We have a relationship with Bullingdon Prison, in Bicester, Aylesbury Way. And a small group of volunteers from Oxford go to Bullingdon Prison. They help select and train a group of men known as listeners. And within the prison, if someone needs to talk to a listener, they press their buzzer, a member of staff comes along and takes them and whichever available listener out of their cells, puts them in the listening suite, and when they're done, press the buzzer again, they go back to their cells. It's a system which works really, really well. Sadly, it all stopped during lockdown, of course, at which time all prisoners in British prisons, as far as I know, were given a simple mobile with 3 locked numbers: family, legal, and the Samaritans. So inevitably, the number of calls we got from prison rose. And we don't know the reason, but those numbers have stayed quite high. I suspect because new staff coming into prison aren't used to these procedures. And of course, who wants to take 2 prisoners out of a cell and put them in a listening suite and put them back when you could say just, well, you just ring Samaritans instead. So we still get a lot of calls from prison. I sometimes think that incredible variety of people we get to talk to it's a bit like every shift is a crazy advent calendar. And you're going to be opening those doors and you have absolutely no idea what is behind those doors. Why do people call us? It's anonymous and confidential, so we have no way of knowing who's calling, let alone recording who they are. But we do make a note after every call, partly so we can look at it nationally as what is distressing people making them call Samaritans. And we have a long list, and I guess the top of that list would be isolation and loneliness. Many callers are ticking many of these boxes, of course. Chronic mental health conditions, both anxiety and depression at one end of the spectrum to really florid psychosis at the other. We're often talking to people who seem to be occupying a kind of delusional reality which has very little connection to the world that you and I know day to day. There's a lot of people suffering from bereavement. A lot of people suffering bereavement from suicide is surprisingly common. Physical illness, particularly physical illness, which affects people's mobility. A lot of people we talk to are housebound, find it difficult to work, to get out, to do their shopping, which also contributes to their isolation. We talk to a lot of victims of abuse that's either going on at the moment or went on in the past. Could be sexual, physical, emotional, and occasionally we talk to the perpetrators of that abuse. Second digression. We get a lot of calls from people misusing the service. It's always a surprise to new Samaritans, and it's always a surprise to people who haven't heard about this before. Most commonly, but not exclusively, it's people ringing up with sexual stories they want to share. Most commonly, but not exclusively, it's male callers wanting to talk to female volunteers. And strangest of all, most commonly, but not exclusively, it's the first shift in the morning, which is bizarrely the sex call shift. The stories they want to share range from the frankly ridiculous to the truly horrific. We're under no obligation to listen to these calls. You know, if we know it's one of these calls, we'll say, look, this call is inappropriate. If you're in real distress at any time, you can ring us back anytime, but I don't have to listen to this. And you get some calls which sort of teeter on the edge, a real call, one of these sex calls. And if you're feeling patient and you've got the energy, you can sit with it and talk to this person and try and get around the story. Because I think it's a fairly safe assumption that someone who's doing this regularly, ringing Samaritans for these stories, is probably not a terribly happy person. And occasionally it works. Occasionally you get to talk to the human being whose initial impulse was perhaps partly about sex, but perhaps more importantly about manipulating someone, about having someone at the other end of the phone and making them listen to what they don't want to listen to, or repeat words back they don't want to say. Yeah, and occasionally you get to talk to the human being doing that. While I'm at it, another digression. Why do people ring us? Sometimes we don't know because they simply don't say. The majority of calls we get are what's called snap calls. Someone just hears your voice and puts the phone down straight away. Of course, you never know why that happens. In my case, maybe they ring me up to make a sex call to a female volunteer. They may just hear my voice and think, no, don't want to talk to him. They may just be really nervous about talking. And we know, because a lot of people say it took me X number of times before I actually said something when I rang the Samaritans. And sometimes they don't put the phone down. They're still there. And you get what we refer to as a silent call. And we'll usually stick with that. If we know someone's there, we'll stick with that for quite a long time, because the assumption is that someone's just finding it really, really hard to talk. I'll often get them to make a noise just to say they're there. And obviously, I can't tell you about the content of any of the calls that I've received because of our principles of anonymity and confidentiality. But I don't think I'm giving anything away if I tell you about the fact that some years ago, I had a call in the middle of the night. I knew someone was there, but they obviously weren't willing to talk. I talked about what we do, our principles, how it all worked. I kept saying I was there if they wanted to talk. I knew they were there. I could hear sort of very faint breathing. And after about an hour, they started talking. And they started telling me things they'd never, ever told anyone else. And that call is always in the back of my mind now when someone's having trouble talking. I think, it's okay. I'm willing to spend my time waiting. If you're there and you're feeling nervous about talking, I'll sit here and wait for you to talk. And sometimes it's really worth it. What do we actually do on the phone? Maybe it's best if I start by saying what we don't do when we're on the phone. So the first thing that we don't do is we don't judge. And I mean by that the sort of large scale obvious thing that if you, for example, if you're in prison, having been prosecuted for a crime of violence, I hope that we treat you with the same respect, dignity, interest and care as we do if we got a call from victims of the same kind of violence outside prison. But I also mean it on a sort of sentence by sentence level that we don't judge. When we're training new Samaritans, they have classes, but they always have a midweek call where someone does a role play. A role play will ring up and pretend to be a Samaritan's caller and will, usually quite difficult, try them out, try out the things they've been learning in the previous class. And always one of those first calls starts with someone saying something like, my husband died 2 days ago. And it's a natural human reaction to say, I'm really sorry to hear that. And of course, what comes back is, I fucking hated him, actually. There's no need to be sorry. The point being that if that imaginary caller was less pushy and less confident and wants to talk about how their appalling husband has died, and you say, I'm terribly sorry for your dreadful loss, the sort of door shuts. Now, it's a really difficult line to learn to draw. If someone rings up and says, I was raped, the very last thing you want to say is, how did that make you feel? That would be appallingly callous. But somehow between those two reactions, there's a line you learn sort of over the months and years, a way of not closing those doors to people. One of the things I've realized after all these years in Samaritans is that during normal conversations, it's not just about exchanging information with each other. We always do a little dance of prediction, expectation, working out what the other person means, working out what they're going to say, working out what they want us to say. And if we're not sociopaths or in a particularly grumpy mood, we always hear what the other person wants us to say, and we can't help but try and fit in with that to some extent. And that's what we try not to do at the Samaritans, because every time you do that, you close the door, and then people often ring up to say the really difficult things they can't say to other people. We don't intervene. There's a big footnote I have to add here. As you probably know, safeguarding laws changed over the last few years in the UK. So now if we find we're talking to a vulnerable adult or a young person under 18 and we think they're in danger, we will give them the opportunity to ask for help and try and get that help. Having said that, we don't know who they are or where they're calling from, so the power is in their hands if they choose not to do that. But putting that aside for the moment, we believe in self-determination and not intervening. I suppose the biggest and most obvious example of that, and this is the thing that proves a real stumbling block for some people who want to sign up for Samaritans, is that it's not common, but every so often someone will ring up and take their lives while they're on the phone. They want someone to be with them while they do that. And we will always ask at least twice if they want medical help. Do they want to call an ambulance themselves and we'll ring back? Or is there some reason why we ought to do it for them? But if they say no, we will stay with them. And we'll stay with them for as long as they're conscious. It's nearly always an overdose in those kind of situations. And we'll only put the phone down if they pass into unconsciousness when we think they can't hear us any longer. There's a paradox at the center of this kind of radical acceptance that, and there is some academic research to back this up, but we all kind of know it instinctively, having been on the phone for years, that by not intervening on it in individual instances, that attitude helps reduce the number of people taking their lives by suicide in general. We've all had calls where we know that saying to someone, you can tell us everything about these feelings, actually reduces those feelings and those plans and intentions. And we've all, anyone who's been there for a few years will have had a couple at least of suicides in progress, as we call them. But we'll have had many, many more calls where someone rings up and is planning to take their lives during the call or that evening. But just the ability to talk about it, the fact that we'll ask really open questions about it, I think reduces those feelings. We don't give advice. This is another really useful thing I've learned from Samaritans. With some exceptions in life, like when you've got a weird lump on your groin or you've got a flat pack table you need to put together, almost no one needs advice. And if they need advice, they know who to get it from. And it's not going to be me and it's not going to be you. They know where to go. What they really need is someone who will ask them what all their options are. And I have lost count of the number of calls I've had which have ended with someone saying, thank you, that was really fantastic advice. And I keep my mouth shut and I think to myself, I've given you no advice whatsoever. You've just listened to yourself. I've said, tell me what you can and can't do. And ask them to spell these things out. And they think it's the best advice in the world. We don't cheer up people or move them on. And this is a really hard thing for mentees to trust themselves to do until they've had quite a few shifts under their belt. You know, it's a natural instinct that we all have when someone talks about a disappointment or bad news or whatever. We always want to say, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. Look on the bright side. It'll be better. We say, I know, I'm sure X loves you. I'm sure it was a natural mistake to make. You'll feel better in the morning. The problem is when you say to someone who's in real distress, let's look on the bright side, it says, look on the bright side, but it also says, I feel uncomfortable talking about this. Let's both look on the bright side right now and put your problems to one side. And I think it's a really rare and valuable thing when, for example, someone rings up and says, I feel like I can't go on. And instead of saying, I'm sure you'll feel better, saying, does that mean you have suicidal feelings? And if they have suicidal feelings, say, would you actually have a plan to take your own life? And if they have a plan to take their own life, going even further and saying, tell me, is it that you really want to be dead? Or can you just see no other way out of a situation which just feels completely intolerable at the moment? You know, because, or saying to someone, tell me about what happened to your childhood. Tell me that abuse, if that's useful for you. I think it really helps people if you can say to them, not cheer up, but tell me the worst things. Tell me the things that really distress you. And I won't be shocked or saddened or disappointed or upset. Just tell me. So what do we actively do? I suppose the obvious thing that we do is just to listen and to remember what people have said. This sounds really simple, but it's very powerful if you have a 40-minute conversation with a stranger and you make short notes during that conversation. And at some point, you refer to something they said 30 minutes ago, and you get the name of their daughter right, or their dog right, or you get a date right, or you know how long they've been married for. You realize how rarely people get listened to with that intensity. And it's not just the things they've said, it's really useful to know the things they've not said as well. I often say to mentees, when you answer the phone to the caller, just imagine that they're asking you into their house. And you're asking about their life. They show you this room and that room. You just take notice of what's in there and maybe make notes. But you also make notice of the doors that kept shut as you're walking through. So later in the conversation, you can say, you told me lots about your son. You haven't mentioned your daughter at all. And that can be really useful. It just shows that you've been listening. We reflect back and sum up. This sounds banal, but I've come to think it's one of the most powerful things that we do. And by that, I mean just listening to what someone says, understanding it, turning it into different words, different, shorter, more compact form, and just reflecting it back at someone. If you're able to say, so from what you've been saying, it sounds like this relationship you have with the husband is quite bullying and manipulative. Or sounds like the feelings you have about your grandmother are very contradictory and conflicting, and they make you really uncomfortable. Or if you say, what you've been saying, it seems that as soon as you're kicked out of home, your life took a wrong turn and you've never been able to get back on track after that. It seems absurdly simple. I have heard so many callers after doing something like that who say, yes, that's it exactly. And I still don't quite understand the slightly magic nature of doing this. I think it's a kind of listening on steroids. It's not just, I've heard what you were saying, but I've thought about what you're saying, and I've thought about it hard enough to simply just to turn it in other words and give it back to you in a different form. And for some reason, I don't wholly understand. People find that quite deeply moving on occasions. We steer into distress. I suppose this is the corollary of not cheering people up, not moving them on. We allow them to talk about the really difficult stuff. You know that scene in the horror movie where you're sort of tracking down the hospital corridors, it's got lots of bends in it? It's got sort of flickering sort of fluorescent lights that keep sort of going, stuttering on and off. And the end of the corridor is really dark. And you know that there is some appalling monster down the corridor. And it's just really unpleasant tracking slowly down that corridor. But when you see the monster, it is always, always a disappointment, isn't it? No monster is ever as scary as the one you think hiding at the end of the corridor in the darkened hotel. And I sometimes think that what we do at Samaritans is we encourage people to look at the monster. Not everyone wants to do it, but there is, again, a kind of rare and valuable comfort in telling to people, it's okay, tell me what happened to you when you were a kid, or tell me what frightens you about dying, or what does it do to you when you cut yourself? Tell me, because no one else is going to ask that question. All of the above kind of rather overconfidently suggest that it works all the time, and it doesn't work all the time. You know, I'm human, we're all human at Samaritans, and the callers are human as well, and sometimes you just don't gel. And sometimes you get it slightly wrong. And sometimes you're meant to get it wrong, and that is precisely why someone has rung you up, because you're a safe person to be angry with. And you just know the phone call is going to end with them telling you to fuck off and then slamming the phone down. And we all know at the beginning of those calls, we tend to refer to them as eggshell callers, because you're walking on eggshells. And a bit of me thinks, oh dear, here we go again. And a bit of me thinks, right, game on. And you think to yourself, maybe if I just sit with this anger and I soak it up and let it burn out and I ask the right questions and I sound interested, we'll end up having a really, really good conversation at the end of this. And sometimes it works, and sometimes you get told to fuck off and the phone is put down on you, whatever you do. I think there's been a huge cultural shift over the last 10 years. I think everyone now accepts that it's good to talk. In fact, I think there are certain places, both offline and online, where that talk about feelings is so busy and loud and chattery that it's sometimes really hard to hear the voices of the people who are really suffering against the background noise. There's a particularly good book recently by Lucy Fuchs called Losing Our Minds, about the way in which we have amplified and sometimes pathologized ordinary negative feelings. And there are several problems associated with that. One was that we have generated a mental health panic, and two, that the people really need help don't really stand out above that noise in the background. For me, the problem is that we've known that it's good to talk, but we don't really learn how to listen. And I think that's a really huge shortcoming. I'm sure we've all had experience where we've needed to talk, we really need to get something off our chests, and someone is there and they're listening, but they're not really hearing us. I've certainly been in that situation. It can be really uncomfortable. And I think this promotion of talking, but the lack of learning how to listen, just replicates that all over the place. At one end of the spectrum, I slightly worry that listening to really difficult things has become commodified. So something you go and spend money to get a professional to do for you. I would really like to see that kind of listening taught in schools, if at all possible. So if anyone in the room could just arrange that before our next meeting, that would be really useful, okay? The difficulty, of course, is that it's really easy to tell people it's good to talk, but getting people to listen requires teaching and learning, effort and time, and ultimately money. I think we fall back on this assumption that being empathetic or being a good listener is something that people are or that they possess, and that it remains true throughout their whole lives. I've come to think that being empathetic is not something you are, but something you do. It's a skill you can learn, and it's a skill you can learn better or less well, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And we all know people who are going to find it a little bit harder to learn some of those skills. But conversely, even the most empathetic, unquote, person in the world is going to find situations in which all that empathy and warmth counts for absolutely nothing. And I think that's one of the shocks when you start at Samaritans, that however empathetic you are To use an extreme example, if someone rings up and says, I feel absolutely wretched, I'm sitting here in the garage with a rope, thinking of taking my life. That warmth and empathy does not give you the skill and the practice for you to know exactly what to say in that moment. We need text, and I think that's true of many of the lower voltage interactions we have on a daily basis, that when not quite so much is at stake. It takes knowledge and it takes practice. When someone comes up to you and says, I'm having a really, I don't know, for example, I've had a diagnosis of cancer. It's really hard to sit with that and say, tell me more about it, and not say, I'm sure it will be all right, or, oh, something similar happened to me last month. If I give any talk about Samaritans, I always imagine in the room there are two possibly slightly intersecting groups of people. One is anyone who might be a potential caller at some point in their lives. To those people in this room, I hope me talking has made you feel a little bit more comfortable about the possibility of ringing up. If you're thinking, mate, you're the last person I'd ring up if I was feeling in distress, don't worry, the chances are several thousand to one that you will get me. And if you do think, but you know what, it sounds a bit like him, you can always put the phone down, because that's what most of our callers do, and ring back. Potential volunteers. I guess what I've said has either encouraged people or put them off by now, but I thought I might end for questions by saying what I think it's done for me, the benefits that I think I've got for it. I think the main one is that I'm much more comfortable with silence now. And I realize in retrospect and with some embarrassment, how much absolute rubbish I used to talk just to fill silences. Now that I'm more comfortable with silence, other people say more. It's not always thrilling, but quite often it's things I realize they wouldn't say to anyone else, or they wouldn't have said to me previously. And I'm really grateful for that. Although I have to say, at the beginning of my training, I did have to learn that sometimes in normal relationships, you have to be really, really judgmental. And there are moments when it's entirely appropriate to say, my God, your ex-husband was a weapons grade shit, wasn't he? Which is not something that we say on the phones at Samaritans. I end most shifts thinking, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. Having opened these little windows in the Advent calendar onto other people's lives, I am hugely grateful for all the good things in my life. When I see people talking what sounds like nonsense in the street or sleeping in doorways, one part in the back of my mind, I can hear my mother's voice from many decades across decades ago, sort of pulling my hand across the street saying, avoid these people. But now I think, you've got a name, you've got a story. If I haven't listened to you, I've listened to many people like you on the phone. And I know, having listened to you and felt really close to you in the middle of the night sometime, that you and I at one time, maybe at school age, had very, very similar lives till our paths completely diverted. I'm also no longer haunted by that thought that I know haunts a lot of people. I wish I could have done more for X, whether X is an elderly parent, or it's your teenage child, or did you find them? There is something about listening to someone on the phone, listening as well as you can, and that conversation coming to a natural close, and knowing that if only slightly they're in a better mental state at the beginning, and then saying, I wish you well, and putting the phone down, talking to a co-volunteer if it was a particularly difficult call, and then taking these notes you made and putting them through the shredder, which is incredibly good practice for the rest of the life. Because I've learned that no one really wants advice. No one really needs cheering up. What they need is someone just to listen to them and accept them. My last two sentences, and I'm getting a drill in the background. What they really need is someone just to say, tell me more, tell me everything. I won't be shocked, I won't be offended. Just tell me. I'll just accept you for who you are. ask me some questions.
What about the random noise? We are building work too. That was wonderful. Very much like listening. You know, I think there's something magical to it. So I think we'll take some questions perhaps to start with, and I'll just check online. And I know that let's see, anybody who wants to ask a question, Kenneth.
First, I just want to say really incredible talk. I was wondering a bit more about how Samaritans has affected your personal life. You spoke about this at the end. One of the things you mentioned is that it's made you more comfortable with silence.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering whether you think it's made you better at knowing what are the right questions to ask in your own interpersonal relationships.
This is basically about teenage children, isn't it? Anyone of a certain age knows that your teenage children are going to be the source of most sort of most difficulties in your life. Most questions. Do you know, and this is something I say to mentees on the phone. People usually know what they want to talk about when they ring up. If you're ever stuck, the one formula that is nearly always appropriate to us is just tell me more. Tell me more about X or Y, and make sure X and Y is the difficult, not the sort of, not tell me more about your daily shopping or tell me more about the gas bill, but tell me more about the stuff that's kind of difficult. So it's just saying, I will listen, tell me more. We talk in Samaritans training about asking open questions. I think that's a bit, and I know the principle behind that, but in fact, it's quite hard to ask open questions. And sometimes people want to be asked quite closed questions. Something is quite important. Someone says, I spent a long time in hospital. It's important to know whether that was a psychiatric hospital or whether they had medical problems. So you want to ask a closed question. But ultimately, it boils down to just tell me more about it. I'm genuinely interested.
When you're in a situation where you think that somebody might need extra help and you want to give them a number or ask them if you should call someone, how do you do that in a way where you're minimizing the risk of them going, no, hang me up, just because you've offered it, I guess? Yeah,
it's hard, and I know the people to whom that's happened. I mean, you have to do it. I mean, it's just you have to sort of square a circle of we know that we're an anonymous confidential service, but we've got to sort of comply with safeguarding law. I think it's just tone of voice and being comfortable. You're not going to win every time. Sometimes people will put the phones down on you, and you never quite know why. I suppose I'll tell you what I will say. In fact, I'll say what you told me, and because of who you are, and because I'm worried about you. This becomes a safeguarding call. It's slightly different than an ordinary Samaritan's call. There's a couple of differences. If you tell me who you are, I would like to tell someone. Would you like to take up that offer? We may be able to get you some help.
So we have two questions online. Yeah. Brianna, do you want to turn on your camera and maybe ask a question, and then Claire afterwards? Great.
Can you see and hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Hi, Mark. I just wanted to ask specifically, such complex emotions, I'm sure, come out for Samaritans and also the other person on the other line. And as a Samaritan, of course, you want to help in any way you can, but your help is essentially to listen. But, you know, when you have a really, really strong case that affects you after that call, is there some sort of aftercare that Samaritans have access to kind of work through those emotions within themselves?
Yeah, and I think this works really well. There's usually two people on a shift, sometimes three people on a shift. We'll talk to each other, first of all, but we also have a system where at the end of every shift, you always ring another Samaritan who is the sort of leader of that shift. So always, even if you don't, if your calls don't match up, so you don't get a chance to talk to your colleagues, you always have to go and talk to someone else on the phone at the end of the shift. And I know people who've had particularly difficult or upsetting calls, and they'll do that. And if the leader of that shift is worried about them, they'll actually ring them in, a day or two time to check in on them. I think that's what I meant about that combination of efficiency and warmth in the branch. I think we do very well looking after people.
That's good news. Thank you.
Great. And Claire, would you like to turn your camera on? So this is Claire Pate, who runs the Empathy Museum, who's listening in.
Hello,
Hi.
thank you. That was fantastic. And I totally agree with you about teaching listening in schools and about the testing period of teenagedom. I just wondered if you felt like there was any sort of tension for you personally between doing the work that you do with the Samaritans and your creative process, or how you manage to keep those two things separate, if you do.
Yes, another version of that question might be, why on earth did they let a writer like you?
Yeah, well, I was being polite.
It didn't go to me at the time. I was initially quite surprised why they didn't grill me harder during the interview. Maybe they just felt a kind of innate trust when they met me. Okay, so the link between creativity and listening to people on a really sort of banal level, obviously it's a principle. You just do not take people's personal stories and use them. But there's also something strange about the lack of overlap between the stories I write on paper and the stories I hear on the phone. Different things make them come alive. When I'm writing a fictional life, a fictional story, I know that what makes it spring off the paper is the odd, strange little detail. You know, it's the type of shoes someone wears, it's the quirks of their voice, it's the things that are really, really strange. People don't talk about their own lives in that way. I think in 6 years of listening, I only about literally a handful of occasions have I thought, you've just told me a detail that I will remember forever. And that's because it's so vivid and so memorable. And this, I think, it's also why when a lot of people start writing memoirs, they realize how hard it is, because the mere substance of your own life doesn't necessarily create an interesting story. You have to put a lot of art and creation into making something spring off the page. You have to do a lot of editing. You have to cut out at least 3 relatives altogether who will then be angry afterwards. And you have to realize that a lot of things that are very meaningful for you are not meaningful for a complete stranger. So I understand what you mean about the overlap of stories, but it's very, very strange that the two things don't really touch each other. The place where they do touch each other is in that idea of, I suppose, what I called looking the monster in the face. I feel much more comfortable these days talking about really difficult subjects. I mean, in the last novel I wrote, there was a central theme of child sexual abuse. And I felt, it sounds strange to say I felt comfortable writing about it, not because I was making any reference to specific cases, but because I know how incredibly common it is. I have a sense now that in any room, in any street, I know that there will be people who've suffered this, and it's a sort of very common and fundamental part of many people's human experience. And I feel a kind of moral, both at Samaritans and when I'm writing, a kind of moral impetus to not turn away from the really difficult things. And I think there is it's not just moral, but there is something paradoxically uplifting about being able to look really hard at the difficult stuff.
So we'll take 2 questions from the room and then Suzanne afterwards. So please.
Nigel.
Oh, that was great.
Thank you.
You stressed the verbal. If we'd seen this written down, I think it would be completely different, because the tone, the intonation, everything about the non-verbal aspects of your voice communicates much more to me almost than the questions you ask. So I wonder how important you think that is, because I'm also a clinical psychologist. I've watched her. She says words that other people say, but something unlocks people and they start confessing things that they never told anybody else, and express desires that they've had or whatever. You know, on a first meeting, there's something about the non-verbal aspect that is crucial to getting people to talk.
I do meet some mentees, and I think you're lucky you have a voice that's given you a real head start. There's just something about your voice which sounds calm and centered and relaxing. I feel like it's taught to you easily. And it's harder for some people, but their voice doesn't have the same kind of timbre to it. But then you also have to remember that that's a wholly subjective judgment of mine, and we get a whole range of people ringing up, and people just respond to different kinds of voices, often because it reminds them of someone they know. So I like the fact that we have people who sound completely different. But I think there's also something you can learn. That being comfortable with silence, with talking more slowly, with not jumping in to fill silences. I think that helps encourage people to talk as well. Is that an answer to the question? But there is a bit of a mystery to it. There's a bit of a mystery to it. Some people.
I think it's something more. Yeah, I think it's something more, and it's we're very sensitive to sincerity. I think we pick up on other people's voices very quickly. And if you're a sincere listener, you're not parroting a phrase that was 19th phrase, I'll open up to you. But if you're reading the list, now ask them, we really going to put this up? But you know, it feels like it's a robot.
You have to be genuinely interested, I think. Well, there's two things that listeners can hear and really respond to. One, you're right, it's sort of the honesty and the integrity. But there's an anxiety you can hear in some people's voices as well. And you can hear an absence of anxiety in some people's voices. And I think that's particularly telling when someone reveals something particularly shocking. You're not going to get someone saying, that's interesting, tell me a bit more about that. Almost anywhere else, unless it's with a psychologist or with Samaritans or someone. And I think that really opens people up.
Shauna?
What stands out for me, actually beyond the art of listening, is the kind of deeper human values that undergird the work. So I'm thinking about trust, tolerance, safety, freedom, free speech. And I'm also thinking about all the safe spaces, so-called safe spaces that are disappearing out there. You know, outside in the kind of public sphere, our ability to express ourselves freely, to speak the truth without fear of reprisal. To what extent is the kind of call line one of our last remaining safe spaces in society? And what kind of transferable skills are there that you could take out into the real world?
It's certainly a safe space in that I think it is the only, I'm not sure whether I said this earlier, I think it's the only remaining national helpline where if you choose, you can be confidential and anonymous. You know, the safeguarding apart, if you decide not to tell us who you are, that's it, we don't know who you are. Also, as long as something doesn't become abuse, you can be who you are. And in fact, one of the difficult things is often to listen to people whose opinions is very angry and whose opinions are very objectionable. And that's the way they express anger. And it's quite hard to sit with that and try and get behind the opinion and find out why they feel like that. And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. I'll tell you one of the things that I think is really important. I haven't talked about this. You can take away into the rest of society. It's something I also remember from being a writer going into prisons. Just going to meet people in places and milieu you have no knowledge about, and you have perhaps rather negative expectations about. It's always a real surprise how normal and ordinary everyone is. You know, talk to people in prisons, talk to people sleeping in the doorways. They're always more like you than you think. There's always a small group of people who are genuinely difficult. Its problems are caused by their inability to get along with other people. It's a real surprise to Samaritans starting out to realize how randomly likability is sort of handed out in society. We've all talked to people in prison who are in prison for doing the most terrible things. And you get to the end of the conversation and you think, well, you're quite pleasant to spend time with, really. And you get to talk to people who are primary school teachers, nurses, and you'll get to the end of the conversation and think you're quite hard company. And I think that's a real lesson. I wish I could take away. That all those people in the groups that you've dismissed for whatever reason, if you just sat down and talked to them, you would find out, you would get on really well with quite a few people in that group. Not everyone, but you would find kind of a real, you would gel with someone.
So we'll take one more online. Suzanne Ostervik, Professor Suzanne Ostervik, who is joining us later on the 15th of November, talking about human suffering, has a question.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can, yes. We
Yeah,
can.
great. Just want to make sure. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Talking about interesting, I wonder what you think is, or maybe they're both equally important, or what you think is more important. Is it the listening component, or is it also showing a genuine interest in the other person? So I'm sort of trying to, ask you what interest in another person, sort of a deep interest in someone, how that plays a role in your conversations.
I think I mean interest in a slightly sort of specific sense, not in the same sense that we're interested in people around them. I encourage the listeners to be interested in specific parts of people's lives. We don't want to get drawn aside by what we tend to refer to as chatting or sort of incidental narratives in their lives, but trying to find a route to the real distress that that person feels. And I just think being interested, I mean, I like most of us as Samaritans, I think we have a genuine interest in other people. We're just fascinated by what makes people work, but using that interest as an engine, not as an end in itself, but as an engine to try and dig out the real reasons why they called. I mean, one of the interesting things is that I think quite a high proportion of people who call us often don't really know why they've called us, or rather, they quite often give a relatively trivial reason for why they're calling us. And you have to often sit with them for quite a long while until you find out what's the story behind that. And I think interest is the engine that helps you make that journey to that other deeper reason. One of a very common instance is that people ring us and you think, I don't instantly understand why an event like that or a mental state like that made you want to call the Samaritans. But if you dig around, if you're interested in their past history and you ask the right questions, you often find that those people have had severe mental health problems in the past, or have occasionally tried to take their life in the past. And then you begin to understand why events in today or in the recent past have a significance for them that is not obvious to people when they just told about them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
So how do you deal with callers who've done something like really terrible and you find yourself like not feeling empathy for this person who, rather than being a victim, is confessing to like abusing a child or something like that?
It is really hard. And in that case, if we're talking to someone who has abused a child, I would say, I'm interested in the you that's distressed. We're here to give you a space to talk about your feelings, your negative feelings. We don't need to hear about what you've done, for example. If I'm talking to people in prison, I will never ask the reason why they're in prison. I will just try and deal with the suffering human being. It's sometimes difficult because particularly people who've done those things often have a very sort of loose border between that and the rest of their lives. And often those can be quite manipulative people. And it's difficult to tell how genuine a call is sometimes. Yes, but we will always still, in fact, one of the easy ways to distinguish what I referred to as sex calls, this misuse of service, from what I might call genuine calls, is to say to someone, I'm not so interested in the details of the story you're telling me, but I'm interested in you. Why are you ringing it? Why has that made you anxious or depressed or panicky? What's made you think, because of that, I want to come on the phone, get on the phone to the Samaritans? And often you hear the phone straight away because they know the gig is up once that has been said. But the other very strange thing, you talked about someone confessing to having done something terrible. And this runs under most Samaritans' calls, and it's deep, deep strangeness that there's a small number of people out there who will ring up helplines to either act out or to talk about narratives which we know are not true. And we know that when someone rings up very regularly and their narrative changes on certain occasions. And so we're aware of that. And there are people who do that and people who are very, very good about that. And we keep a record of some of those stories which keep cropping up. So we're aware of the possibility that they're out there. So we never 100% know that what someone's told us is absolutely true. And of course, that's true even for sort of genuine calls as well. One of the strange things about putting the phone down, putting the phone down at the end of a suicide in progress, you never really know what's going to happen. You think someone's passed into unconsciousness. You wish them well. You say, I don't think you can hear me anymore, so I'm going to put the phone down. Goodbye. They may wake up minutes later with a sort of a raging headache and throw up. Paramedics may come to the door. You just never know what happens. And that, I think, has been a really good life lesson for me. You just have to let it go. You do your best and say goodbye and let it go. And you will never know the end of the story.
Do we have more questions? There's one from Shamil, maybe perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, you covered some of this before, so did an amazing job. I'm just like interested in this difficulty of putting compassion with equanimity at the same time. We just talked about having to let go, the things you can't do, and on the other side, you know, when someone is in real suffering, distress, you know, your heart opens and you feel, what can I do to help? And to some extent, there's a sort of feeling they're suffering, you know. People are in a terrible situation, and you know from your own life what it feels like, and so there is some sort of neurons or some sort of feelings in you that is co-suffering in a sense. How do you balance this equanimity? Look, I want to help and I'm suffering along with you. On the other side, you just can't do anything. One of these things in life, you just have to let go. How does that balance come? How do you do that?
I think I've learned, I think most Samaritans learn, that urge, that thought, what can I do to help, is really unhelpful. And it sort of gets in the way of actually helping people. Because what can I do to help is about me, really, isn't it? What's my role in your suffering? I need a role in your suffering. I'd like to be able to survive and help you. And I think you just learn to put that aside. But what fills that space is the discovery that just listening, which seems so minimal, there seems to be so little to do it. You know, I describe what we do on the phone and people say, but you're not really doing anything, are you? And it's true. Sometimes, some calls, you're doing very, very little. But it's a wonderful surprise to realize how much that gives to someone. And it gives to them more than they lose by you trying to help them. Very occasionally people ring up and they have quite specific practical problems. We do have a short list of other organizations we'll refer them on to, but most people know about the existence of them anyway. They know that when they ring us up, they just need to talk. And our urge to help them is something you just have to get. And you'll help them more as a result.
Is that, I mean, curious just in terms of applying that in ordinary relationships in normal life, you know, with family members suffering, and does that skill set, like, do you apply that directly, or is there a more balance in between what can I do to help? Can I drive into hospital?
Yeah, obviously in real life there are practical. I think the thing is to say, in real life, I'd say, what can I do to help you? And then do it, and that's it. And then if it's too much, you say, I'm going to stop right there. Also, I think a lot of Samaritans will say, yeah, when I'm with Samaritans, I'm really non-judgmental. I can apply all these principles, but when I get home, I take my cape and my mask off, and I'm just me. I'm a pain in the ass, and I get everything wrong. And I think it's made me better in real life. Well, the person I'm really bad at applying it to is me. I often have conversations with my wife, and she says, "You just could be nicer to yourself. Imagine that you were calling yourself at the Samaritans. You'd be much nicer than you are just sitting on the sofa talking to yourself." That's the one I haven't learned yet. What's Rory? Hello?
You have this amazing insight into the nation's psyche in a way.
Yeah.
So I wonder, to what extent do you feel, since you've done this for many years, to what extent do you feel that what people are calling about or how they express themselves reflects some of the broader things going on in the world or in society? Is there any connection at all? Have you seen things, you know, the kind of things come up that didn't 7 years ago, for example?
I would have to look at the sort of the statistics in the supercomputer at Samaritan Centre. But what we really notice is how little external events that, I mean, we're all kind of the newspaper reading classes, aren't we, in this room? We're sort of latched onto the news. I think we forget that we're more plugged into a lot of stuff happening than other people. It was really interesting at the beginning of COVID, at the beginning of lockdown. We thought the nature of the calls would change. We got more prison calls for the obvious practical reason, but strangely, very, very little change. We can't really tell why. Anecdotally, we feel that a lot of people were leading lives that were quite locked down already. A lot of people had mental health problems which so preoccupied them that what was going on in the outside world was just a sort of an irrelevance to them. Later on in during the lockdown, there were more people, it affected more people, but it affected most of them because of their lack of access to medical and mental health care. So I think, and we certainly have new, as it were, tick boxes on our list. We put debt on there now. How many people are coping with debt? Although I personally haven't noticed an uptick in that yet. Gender and sexuality, that hasn't, a few people, but not very much. I think those main items of loneliness and isolation, mental health, physical health, and abuse, and neighbours. I mean, I suspect, I suspect Australopithecus in Ethiopia was complaining about the neighbours, and everyone still is. And I think those, I mean, you're right, things have changed in society, but I think those things, I think they remain a constant. And those things are the things that drive people to phone us. Rory.
I was just wondering if you talk about the importance of listening to people that you're listening to.
No, because they'll be telling them what to do, wouldn't it?
Well, you could, it depends how you phrase it. You could say, have you ever thought about?
No, if
There was that advice.
I would never ever say, have you thought about?
Okay.
That's part of
I'm
it.
sure you'd have a more sort of
Been a way of
professional way of
saying
expressing it.
No, I would never, we would never, and I hope that Samaritans never make suggestions of how to change in any way.
Okay. I'm just saying that in my own sort of experience of working with people, listening and loneliness seem to have a lot of people who end up being very, very lonely. People who don't know how to listen.
One of the reasons for not giving advice, quite apart from the fact that it kind of shuts down conversations, I think, and the fact that you very rarely give people advice they haven't already thought of, which makes you incredibly annoying. It just shuts down that one way. It's stuff coming from you to them.
I think I was probably phrasing it in the wrong way. I've been trying to sort of
I'm sure the
importance of that listening in life.
I think it's hugely important, but we never know why someone is lonely, do we? And that's the other thing about giving advice. You might think you have a great piece of advice, but you know so little. You know, you talk to this person for 20 minutes, half an hour. You can't see them, you can't see the flat there, and you don't even know the reality they're living with. So yeah, there may be things they could learn, but it would be presumptuous and unhelpful of us to think that we had any idea of what they're most doing. And if I hear a mentee saying, have you ever thought?
I'm sorry.
Okay, let me have the last question though, because I've been curious about this as I opened up, saying, because really we're talking about the link between suffering and flourishing.
Yeah.
And you've made a case, and I think a very good case, of truly listening, listening with empathy, not being prescriptive, but really engage yourself and not constantly think about what the next question you can tell them or ask them or tell them about yourself, right?
Yeah.
Clearly becomes a lifeline. And you mentioned how some of the people have come back to you and said, that was really, really helpful. And you said, all I've done is really just reflect what they've given me. So to what extent do you think that listening really is a meaningful tool that we could use, not just in that specific situation, but in general? Is it something that we should perhaps think about when as we are trying to lead better lives? Would this be a tool that you would recommend? I mean, you said you took it off, but at the same time, you also said that it made you a different kind of person, this experience of the last 6 years.
Yeah.
And sometimes, in fact, and that you didn't say it today, but you told me that sometimes you probably become too much like the listener in real life. And as you also said in the beginning, sometimes you have to give your opinion about. So what do you think? Do you think that this suffering that people go through is enhanced and perhaps even become meaningful as they see themselves reflected in your mirror?
From their experience?
Mm-hmm.
I think I've learned never to ask that question, because that goes beyond the end of the call, doesn't it?
No, but I'm not asking you whether you should ask them. I'm asking your experience. Because you have intuitions. You haven't really told us about those, but you have intuitions about that kind of call. So what is your feeling? Because
I certainly have intuitions. I try hard not to sort of think in general terms about what happens to everyone. I really try hard, and this is part of the principle, stick with every call as it is. It's like when a caller will say, you've got plenty of other people to listen to. I always say, you're on the phone now, so you're the most important person. Everyone else can wait to talk to someone else. And everyone is completely different. I know that for some people, we have all had people on the phone saying things they've never said to anyone else. And we've had a very strong sense that maybe some corner has turned in their lives. Where that life goes after we put the phone down, we just don't know. And it's really important to ask, because you would just send yourself absolutely bananas wondering about that. And we've all had calls all the time, where quite clearly someone feels less angry, less alone, less suicidal at the end of the call. And again, you have to let it go. That's what's important. That's what I'm homing in on. It's saying, and I think this is what I find really useful. Just think about the call itself. If I go searching for some greater message or meaning for all of this, it's a wild goose chase, because you have to let people go. And I think that's a lesson for life, for the whole of life. And maybe that's what I take away from it. Not what we do for people's lives, not how we better their lives, because ultimately I won't ever know. But ultimately it's about doing your best and saying, that's it, and then putting the phone down.
So in other words, if we then turn the way and we now look at the kind of meaning that it gives to you, it clearly has made a difference. It really has made a huge difference in your life over the 6 years. The way you also told the story of your life was a return to this. So yes, I think this is very exciting stuff. And so I will encourage you to stick around. There's more coffee, more tea. Talk to Mark, talk to people in the center. We're doing this again next week, not here, but in Stoke House. Next week, we'll talk about the when a baby becomes a person. Later in term, Suzanne, who asked the question, will tell us about the scientific exploration of suffering. And I hope again, that we'll be able to pick up these threads, because I think rather than just talking about happiness that we don't really know what is, I think there is something here to be looked at from a very interdisciplinary point of view. And one of the things I loved about your talk, of course, was you wasn't appealing to science, and yet we were all, those of us who are scientists, getting ideas about how we might be able to understand that in other terms, and perhaps, or perhaps not, that might help. So I'll encourage you to stick around. And then thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Mark, for a fantastic talk.